What's going on, everyone? We are back with another tier list, and I know you all love it because I am doing this because of popular request. So many of you asked me to rate these leaders and eventually rate a lot of the cards or even do a pre-release as I've done with the previous sets for you all. So that's what we're doing. Pre-releases are coming up, and well, a lot of you are going to go ahead and build some decks. Not only that, but also drafts are going to be happening for set 4, and all of that will kind of be similar to the pre-release. I personally find those formats the most fun, more fun than Premiere. I just can't necessarily do that every single day on video for you all, so unfortunate there. But that said, we're going to be ranking these leaders in a limited context, in the context of set 4 cards only, because those are the packs we're going to be opening, and of course, just in general, what value they can accrue in a limited setting or a pre-release setting. So, without further ado, I want to say a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and also I have a TCG player link in the description down below. Let's dive into it and talk about these leaders and tiers. First off, we've got to talk about the tiers. Now, you might have noticed that the D tier is actually completely gone, and this is generally the case for pre-release, I'd say, or limited in general, is that sometimes you'll pick a leader just because of the aspects it has. So to me, there isn't really any leader that is completely unplayable. Now, of course, there are leaders that are pretty mediocre and don't really do a whole lot. But again, sometimes your cards that you have in your deck or the cards that you open, you're just kind of forced in a position where you actually do want to pick up that leader because it's going to give you the most options. So D tier is going to be gone. As for S tiers, these are going to be the leaders that really give you a significant advantage by playing them. These are the leaders that maybe you don't have a ton of cards in their aspect combination, but it doesn't matter because it's worth it just to play this leader itself. Especially someone like Anakin, for example, from set 3. That was the type of leader that was in S tier. It just made every single one of your cards better and gave you so many options throughout the game. A tier leaders, these are leaders that you definitely want to index towards if possible. They're not going to be game changers on their own necessarily, but give you a good amount of value to where it is worthwhile to run them. Oftentimes, your leaders that cost like 6 is a good breakpoint to where you actually just get enough value to want to play them. Because at 6, you get a little bit more stats, a little bit more powerful effect, and usually games last longer. So oftentimes, even though they cost more, because they give a greater effect, they get more valuable and they'll end up in A tier. B tier leaders, these are leaders that are serviceable. They're not great. They're not terrible. They're not going to give you a heavy advantage, and they're not going to go ahead and just like be completely useless, or rather very, very not useful. But they are completely serviceable if you have a lot of cards or powerful cards in that specific aspect combination. And then C tier leaders are literally the leaders that you only want to play if you have no other options. These are the leaders that are going to be played because you've got your, let's say for like set 2, for example, you had like 2 Podamarons in your pool. And you're like, I don't have any aggression heroism leaders, or the other combination I have, or whatever you're running doesn't match up to play those cards. Well, I'm going to play this leader just so that I can put those cards in my deck and have a better cohesive deck. Those are the C tier leaders. They might have a little bit of something here and there. And of course, they're going to have their leader flip, ideally. So that's going to be something to consider. But that said, let's talk about the cunning leaders first. So first off, we've got Kazuto Xiono. This one is kind of interesting. Definitely someone that really gains a lot of value if you're able to pair those cards that work specifically with Kazuta in the deck. But unfortunately, we don't have Millennium Falcon for set 1. We don't necessarily have a guaranteed Fireball. We don't have a necessarily guaranteed the Bounty Hunter Contractor or whatever that one was that's ambush that defeats at the end of turn. We don't have a lot of ways to really leverage Kazuta's ability necessarily. There are a few commons that you can kind of use this action and maybe get a little bit of value here and there. But in general, I would say that this ability isn't particularly useful in a limiting setting. However, it's not quite a C tier for me because he does deploy really early. So because he deploys on 4 resources, he comes out earlier than most, if not all the other leaders, with the exception of the Major Von Reg. And this guy is +3/+3. +3/+3 on a vehicle, which is going to be very common in the set, is pretty solid. The 2/5 body, meh. You really want to get a value out of that pilot upgrade, right? That +3/+3. So if you're able to get value out of that, I would say this guy gets into like a low B tier. Otherwise, he's going to be a C tier. Next up, we've got the Han Solo. This is going to be one of the guaranteed leaders, kind of like we have with set 2 and set 3. Han Solo and the Aggression Boba Fett are going to be guaranteed options in your pre-release pack. So you're always going to have a Cunning Heroism leader option. Han isn't that great. I will say he's definitely better, in my opinion, than Kazuda. And that's mainly because he comes down on that 5th resource, gives you a little bit of extra stat line, and gives you a little bit extra stat line in the ground arena, potentially. You do have a little bit of value with that Han Solo action occasionally. You're going to have a lot of odd cost units in general. There's a limited deck size, 30 cards. Usually in that 30 cards, you're going to have roughly half of them odd costs. And that's going to be pretty decent to go ahead and trigger this action, get a little bit of value here and there. Not to mention, you can really leverage additional couple of resources, assuming your deck has the proper cards for it. But that's assuming you get the right pool. And, well, you could say the same thing kind of about a Kazuda. If you open like triple Fireball, my goodness, maybe you got something brewing there. But there's no guarantee that Han can really, really push the limits when he flips. So there's a good chance you can get a little bit of value, but not an insane amount of value. And the stat line isn't good enough to really push him above like a mid B tier for me. Next up, we've got Admiral Akbar. This one is a troublesome one to evaluate. We definitely have an interesting ability to kind of get some more and more value as you go through the game. You can exhaust any one of your units to go ahead and create an X-Wing token with that 1 cost action. He comes down to 6 resources and doesn't have the piloting option. He's a 3/8, so pretty mediocre body as a leader flip. Kind of an okay ability. The extra 1 resource cost doesn't matter as much in limited because you're going to have a messed up curve. There is going to be a good amount of space units. I think that this does generate a good amount of value, and I will go ahead and put it, and it seems odd to put all the Cunning Heroism ones here, but I will actually put it higher than Han. One of the things with limited oftentimes is doing a little bit of what we call dirtling, where you kind of just generate a little bit of value here and there. Can actually work itself out in some games, but in other games where your opponent has a decently aggressive curve, I think Admiral Akbar will really struggle. So I don't think it's really great. It's just maybe useful in some situations. And now that I mentioned that, I think I should put it below Han. These are all very close together in my opinion, and maybe Akbar's at the bottom of this because I do find, at least in my brief playings of some of the draft cards, the format seems to be reasonably fast, especially with some pilot upgrades and getting in a ton of damage. If you don't have removal, which you probably won't, you're not able to really compete in terms of just dirtling out and doing a lot of these value plays like Akbar. So I'm actually going to put him probably at the lower end of B tier. Not a terrible ability, but has to have the right matchup for it to get some value. Next up, we got Rio Durant. This one's actually a quite decent one in my opinion. You're going to be able to get the Saboteur effect and the attack in, assuming you got a lot of space units. This is going to be a really nice ability because you're not going to be playing on curve a lot of the times in a limited deck. So that extra resource will be able to get used. You will be able to cut through shield tokens, which is oftentimes a very annoying something to deal with. You'll be able to cut through sentinels and just get a little bit of a power bump in terms of attack. He also flips a +4/+5 if you do happen to have the proper specifications. I believe it's transport. If you have a transport, it's going to give +1. So it's the +4/+5 total, which is actually a really nice bump in stats. And that can end the game very quickly. I play a little bit with Rio. I definitely think he's somewhere around like top of B tier, maybe low A tier. I'm going to put him in low A tier for now, but definitely one that we might have to revisit as we go further on. Next up, we've got Admiral Trench. This guy is weird. He's very weird, right? His action isn't actually that great in a limited deck. You actually do burn through your cards pretty quickly. And there are actually many games I've had that come down to having no cards in your deck. So using this action more than let's use it like 3 or 4 times, that's a good chance that you've actually pushed down to the bottom cards of your deck, and that might put you in a losing scenario, especially with Trench as your leader, because when you flip him, you're going to be really removing a chunk of your cards. So not only is this action kind of like okay, it's okay if it was the only thing that was removing cards from your deck. But remember, when you flip Trench, you're going to get 4 cards off the top of your deck and discard the other, and discard all of them essentially, right? You're going to draw one of them, discard 3. 4 cards is more than 10% of your entire deck. I don't actually think you could do that all that often. So yes, you might be able to flip them like twice. That's 8 cards of your deck. And sometimes that's going to be a bomb or something that your opponent can choose not to have you draw. So I actually think Trench is pretty bad because of all that. He might be the closest to a D tier because I don't really find that you're going to be able to get the value out of him, since your opponent's going to be able to choose the worst card to give you or the worst 2 cards to give you. And in the limited scenario, that's going to be really devastating. And because most of the cards you're in your deck are kind of just serviceable, and he flips as a 4/5, so you really want to get 2 flips with him to actually get the value going from Trench, because the resource count isn't oftentimes the big kind of setback with some of these leaders or the late game leader deploys, because you'll oftentimes get to them. It's more about, can you go ahead and have plays throughout the game? And if you can, and then you have to wait till 6 to resource and you pay the 3, you're probably not going to have something to back that up to use the other 3 resources. And you're removing a lot of cards from your deck. And the whole point of Trench is that you want to go late because you're drawing extra cards out, kind of valuing your opponent and then being able to flip Trench again. But you can't do that because your deck is too small. It's too small to be able to do that. So I think Trench is the closest to D tier. I think he actively is a downside if you are flipping him multiple times. So I'm gonna have to put Trench in the C tier here. And next up, we move into Aggression, where we find Major Von Reg as the first option. I'm gonna make a lot of comparisons to Rio with Major Von Reg because they have similar kind of prerequisites. Rio wants to play all space units. Major Von Reg wants to play all vehicles. All space units are pretty much vehicles. I don't really know of a space unit that isn't a vehicle now that I think about it. Maybe there is one and someone will let me know. But the Rio and Major Von Reg really want, when you open your packs, to have a lot of opportunity to build a decent deck out of the common space vehicles. And in Major Von Reg's case, you do have access to the vehicles on ground as well. So you actually do have some more options. But without any vehicles, you really aren't getting a whole lot of value out of Major Von Reg. Similar to a like Boba Fett Daimyo, you really want to be curving vehicles into vehicles into vehicles. Now the tokens do count, but that's not playing a vehicle. So you really want actual cards in your deck that are vehicles. As such, I don't think this is as strong as Rio, and it might seem odd because isn't this a free ability? Isn't this, similar restrictions? Yes, but there's 2 things about Major Von Reg. I still say he's pretty decent. Like, his ability actually does give you a little bit of extra value. Like, if I were to compare Kazuda to Major Von Reg is essentially just better, in my opinion. And that's because your action is just going to be more relevant than Kazuda's action in the vast majority of games. And you still deploy at that 4 cost, which is pretty nice. But Rio, even though it costs 1, again, you're not going to be using up every resource that you have every turn, oftentimes in limited. And this guy gives +4, +5 in terms of stats very frequently, or +3, +5 in terms of space. And that's a lot of stat points. There's just a lot of stat points compared to +3, +3, only for a turn later. Now, Major Von Reg can be a very aggressive leader if you do happen to pick up that space kind of suite. The other thing, as I mentioned, there's 2 things, is Rio has some better commons and uncommons available to him in his aspects. Whereas Major Von Reg, while there are some okay ones, the commons and uncommon space units that you're seeing are either a little bit more expensive in terms of like cost, or just not as solid of cards in a limited setting. So that's why Major Von Reg is just going to be slightly below in A tier than the Rio. Podameron's up next, and this guy is pretty amazing, to be honest. Like, pretty amazing. I'm gonna actually have to put this guy in S tier. A unit that can consistently get value throughout the game, but then can also be deployed as just straight up a 4/6 is crazy good. A 5 flipping 4/6 leader is already decent enough. It's already decent enough. But add to the fact that you can use, again, these spare resources that you're sitting around. Similar to what I mentioned about Rio, is you'll play a unit, but now you get to use an extra resource. By giving that unit +2/+1, it's just going to be amazing for your overall value of the game. I am actually very happy that they put Poe Dameron here as a rare leader, because if they had not, I would think that this guy's going to be way too common so you play it. Similar to how Anakin was. Anakin, he was a common, I believe. I remember him seeing all the time, but I believe Anakin was a common last set, and that means that we saw Anakin all over the place, and that's because he was so good. I think Poe Dameron, his consistent value, his ability to be deployed still as a 4/6 good body early on in the game is just going to be really tough to deal with. Now, again, you're going to need some vehicles to really push this guy to the next level, but if I have one set or one aspect that has a good amount of vehicles, I'm absolutely, and I have Poe Dameron, trying to index towards Poe Dameron to take advantage of Poe Dameron himself. Again, one resource for +2/+1 is crazy good in terms of getting value throughout the game. That's going to really put a massive problem in space for your opponent. And you could even still continue to use him after he dies on the ground, which is incredibly crazy. And you can move him around, which you will be doing in limited. Next up, we've got Captain Phasma, and I am unfortunately not super impressed with this one, but she's not terrible. And the reason being is she is really based around First Order, which is not going to be all that common. Okay, First Order in general aren't common tags. In terms of aggression cards, like in her aspect, you have 2, and it's the TIE Fighter and the 1-cost unit that I forget the name of. You don't really want to be playing that 1-cost unit. The TIE Fighter is just an okay playable, so you're not really going to get a ton of action triggers from Phasma. And then add to the fact that you only have like in total like 5 other First Order units in the entirety of the set outside of those 2 that I mentioned. That's really low in terms of actually getting those cards in your deck. So you're not really going to get this action triggered all that often, but she is a 5 to flip 4/6. That is good enough. That is good enough in limited. A 5 to flip 4/6, as I mentioned with Poe Dameron, this is just a strong stat line. I'm going to put her above Admiral Akbar. I still find Kazuda to be a little bit stronger just because you can deploy him earlier and you do get that +3/+3. Even though Captain Phasma's ability is almost as useless as Kazuda, I do find Captain Phasma just being a 4/6 is going to be nice. And if you do happen to have any First Order units and you do happen to play them the same turn Phasma comes down, you can really get a little bit of value going with her on-attack trigger, which can be nice. But very, very similar. I do think Kazuda is just going to outweigh her a little bit in terms of the placement, just because he can come down a turn earlier and really put on that pressure, which is going to be quite nice. Next up, we've got Luke Skywalker, and this one is, I think, quite solid. The question I have is whether or not it's an A tier or an S tier leader to me. He's definitely better than Rio or Major Von Reg. We've seen him just do some major work already in the games, just normal games in Premiere. Now, you do have a couple of commons that are fighters in the aspects that you're looking for. The most important one is that Y-Wing. The Y-Wing is that 1/3 indirect damage. That is a fighter. You'll be able to attack with that, get the trigger going. You have a couple other common ones that are like neutral aspect. Of course, you have some uncommons and rares. You have the A-Wing in command. That's also a common. Those cards are all going to fit really nicely within Luke. Okay, all of that's great stuff. So that's going to give you a little bit of value in the early game. And arguably more important is when you do flip Luke, okay, you're going to be able to get this really powerful ability. If you have any fighter on the board, just constantly deal 3 to some unit, and you get a +4/+5 leader for 6 to flip. And if you're attacking on the ground, you get a 5/6. Like, that is a really aggressive stat line, right? 4/6 to flip. So just in terms of flipping him, he's really powerful as a leader. And if you happen to have any fighters available to you, and again, there are a few out there that are on the common level. There are the heroism, resistance, X-wing fits in that category. You have a bunch of rares, but then you also have aggression, heroism commons that are fighters, and command heroism commons that are fighters, and command fighters that you can absolutely work, and even like some vigilance heroism. There are some options at the common level, which is really important to be able to get that deck functioning. So I do think Luke, for all those reasons, is going to end up in A tier, and a good chunk of that goes to his leader flip. But then we've got Boba Fett, and Boba Fett does actually have a pretty good leader flip ability as well. And do I want to put him even higher into the S tier? There is an argument for the S tier for Boba Fett. So his frontside action is honestly not as exciting. You're not going to be dealing as much non-combat damage. You might have a couple cards that deal indirect damage or something like that, so you'll get a few triggers here and there. Really, with Boba Fett, it's that flip that I'm really interested in. If you happen to have a good amount of space units and you are able to deploy him as a pilot, you get a 4 damage divided as you choose amongst enemy units flip, which is really, really quite powerful. The question I have is that going to outweigh the potential repetitive value of Luke Skywalker? I am actually not quite sure. +4/+4 isn't that much more aggressive than these two. So if you are a more aggressive deck, potentially you go with that Major Von Reg and you try to just use the fact that he's deploying 2 turns earlier, for example, than Boba Fett. Boba Fett's a guaranteed option in your pre-release packs. This is a good one to go with, because of the fact that you have this flip that's going to be like this mini overwhelming barrage that can knock out a few units. And if your opponents are playing a lot of space units, those are going to be lower toughness, which means 4 damage is going to matter a lot. But then again, if you consider Luke and you compare the two, because they're kind of right next to each other, Luke has a repetitive 3 damage dealing every single action, and you get more stats from him. And he deploys as a better stat leader or a more aggressive stat leader on the ground if you choose to do so. For all those reasons, I think Boba Fett's just kind of slightly behind Luke, but I think he is a very, very solid option. And you know, you could argue that he is an S tier. You could argue that he is an S tier leader. You could argue that. But that's going to be aggression. Next up, we've got command cards, and I'm sure I'll have to shuffle some leaders around here as we go further and further. But first off, we've got Wedge, and Wedge is certainly one of those cards where if you have a good amount of pilots in your deck and you have the vehicles to support him, he is going to be solid. But I actually think he's more of like a B tier leader, maybe at the close end of top end of B tier, because he does have a little bit of higher potential than some of these other B tier leaders. And of course, if you do get the pilots and you get the vehicles to associate with those pilots, yes, Wedge is going to be great, but you do need that combination. You need that combination for Wedge to really get some value out of this action. This is one of those leaders where, depending on your pool, your pre-release pool, this guy could be one of the best options. You happen to open up Chewbacca, and now you can deploy him for 2 instead of 3 on your unit. You happen to open a couple of other good pilots that you could actually reduce those costs and get the value, right? You really want to be deploying units and immediately upgrading to get that value early on, and then close out the game when Wedge comes down. That's what you're trying to do. And if you happen to open that pool, he can go up. And I do think he could go up potentially A, maybe even S tier, depending on your pool. If you open up like the Han Solo unit / pilot upgrade, and you've got like Chewbacca, and you got some important units that can synergize with those pilots. However, I think the vast majority of pre-release decks are going to find this guy as a serviceable option. You'll have, 5 to 6 vehicles or maybe more in this set. In my experience, it's been a little bit more than the previous ones. Previous sets are like 5 to 6 vehicles, but in this set, it's a good amount more. Maybe like half your deck is a potential option that happens. And then you've got, 3 or 4 pilots, or maybe you got a couple pilots. It's not really going to give you a whole lot of value out of Wedge, because you're not going to be able to use them every single turn to get that discount. So to me, high B tier, has a lot more potential, but not really going to do all that much. Next up, we've got Holdo, and unfortunately, Holdo's going to go into the C tier. I took a look before I started recording this video as to how many resistance units, how many fighters, how many this, that, and the other thing, just in terms of just getting my head wrapped around it. And there are 0 common resistance units in Command Heroism. 0. That's a huge downside for Holdo. The few commons that you do have are either like an expensive Vigilance unit, an expensive Cunning unit, or that one Heroism 2-drop that is a 2/2 base, and you have to put a pilot on it or upgrade it. No, I think it's a pilot. I believe it's a pilot to give +1/+1 in order for it to be a good unit. That's way too specific. It is too many things trying to make Holdo work. And although she, in some cases, can give some of your resistance this little tiny bump for that one resource, which is actually not bad in a limited sense. Like, if there was a ton of resistance units, I could definitely see her being like an A tier leader, to be honest. The one cost give +2/+2 is actually decent. There's just not enough resistance units to go ahead and get that done. Now, there are a few resistance upgrades in Command Heroism that you could like pilot on to a vehicle, but those are uncommons. There's not any common upgrades that you can go ahead and put on your units in Command Heroism. That's just a huge downside, and because of that, it's not that great. You do have a 6 to deploy leader that doesn't really do anything either, with the fact that you don't have any resistance units. It is a 3/8. It's not very aggressive. The extra toughness doesn't matter as much. This is just not a very strong leader. If you happen to have great Command Heroism cards, sure, but in terms of Holdo specifically, nah. Next up, we've got Darth Vader. Now, this one I am pretty excited about. I would actually put Darth Vader in the S tier. I think this guy's actually quite good. Now, part of the reason for that is there's going to be a lot of vehicles. There's going to be a lot of space units that you can play, just in general. Any vehicle unit that you attack with, assuming it's a non-token, on the ground and space, is going to be able to generate an extra 1/1. Generating a 1/1 every single turn is pretty obnoxious. It is pretty obnoxious. But then, arguably the most important part is that he is flipping on 6 resources and gives you a +5/+5 upgrade or a 5/6 body, similar to Luke. That's very aggressive and generates multiple TIE Fighter tokens to take advantage of continuing to dominate the space arena. This is going to generate a lot of value as you go through the game. It's going to be one of the go-to options for command villainy. There is enough value here to where, hey, okay, do I have the support for Vader? Yes. Okay, I'm going to index towards Vader, even though I don't have a ton of command villainy cards. But if I have, a decent amount of space units or a decent amount of vehicles in the early turns, I'm gonna be like, yeah, I'm gonna slap Vader in my deck, even though I can't get the massive card pool or whatever that I'm looking for, because Vader himself is just gonna work so well. Again, these S tier leaders, they're gonna be cards you're gonna be wanting to look to put in your deck because they're gonna be such a big payoff, but you still need to meet the conditions as to why they are specifically good. And this one is not a extremely rare one to meet. It's very common to have many vehicles in your deck in this draft format. Next up, we've got Piet, and well, guys, I think you all know where Piet is going, to be honest. He's not quite a C tier, There are a few different capital ships that are in his aspects or potential aspects. Most of them are very expensive or high rarity. Honestly, you're really looking to probably lean in towards Vigilance, where that's where you can see a couple of the common capital ships actually do some work. But to be honest, this guy isn't terrible. He's definitely on the low end of the list, which I'm sure you all expected because, I need capital ships to actually get value, huh? Well, things like Resupply Carrier, that's a common. Getting ramp in, being able to play a 4/5 for 5 and ramp at the same time is pretty good. You have things like the Fleet Interdictor, the Sentinel. That's not too bad. Not playable in general for Premier, but a massive Sentinel in space that you can cheat on its cost is pretty nice. The problem is that a lot of the capital ships that we are using, like Ruthless Raider or Devastator in the earlier set, or Avengers or things like that, are from the earlier sets, and they're high rarity cards. So it's unlikely for you to find a card that Piet's going to be absolutely amazing with. Of course, if you sit there and you happen to open up like the Invisible Hand or Invincible or like multiple of those or multiple powerful capital ships, maybe you could index towards Piet a little bit and he gets a little bit better. I don't think he's really going to go below or above like the bottom of A tier, but I definitely see this guy, even with just like the base level capital ships like resupply carriers and things like that. I don't know if I'm going to put him above Kazuda, but definitely decent in that spot. But that's going to be command. Let's move on to vigilance. Next up, we've got Rose Tico, and this one's kind of an interesting one. I know a lot of people are really oftentimes like, why are you kind of dumping on Rose Tico so much? It's because in Premier, you have so many better units that just immediately trade. You do things that you want to versus things that you have to do. In Limited, I actually think Rose Tico is like maybe bottom of A tier, maybe even above like Major Vonreg and Rio. And in fact, because of the 4-6 flip, I'm actually going to put Rose Tico a little bit higher. Now, of course, you're not going to get a ton of value out of her action every single turn or anything like that. But there are a lot of situations where you're attacking into a unit just to go ahead and get some damage on that unit and then proceed to attack it the following turn. That does not happen as much in Premier. So in Limited, it's a lot of it's like value, a lot of value. And Rose Tico generates a lot more value than a lot of other decks by allowing you to potentially trade one of your units with multiple of theirs by continuously healing it with Rose Tico. So that action will actually come into play in Limited a lot more often. And then add to the fact that she's a 5 to flip 4-6. I've continuously talked about this, but this is a good stat line. It's aggressive to where your opponent kind of has to deal with it. And you still are able to go ahead and get the 2 heal. And in fact, you don't even need to attack with that vehicle unit to get that 2 heal or the heal 2 on a vehicle. So that all kind of generates a good amount of value. And Rose Tico actually does do some work in Limited. And to follow that up, Lando. I actually think Lando's pretty good as well. I'm going to put Lando in the A tier. In Limited, you're going to have the vehicle, you're going to have the ground units, and you're going to have the space units. So it's not unlikely to have one of each and be able to get just these shields all the time. Add to the fact that Sentinel is actually a pretty powerful effect in Limited. The biggest downside for Lando is the fact that you do not have the ability to get to 7 resources all the time. So that action really has to carry you. But that action is actually very powerful. It is very, very powerful. You can choose where that shield token goes, even a little bit better than, for example, in set 1, Luke Skywalker was one of the better leaders. I would have put him in the A tier as well. But Lando's ability, I would actually find to be even better than Luke's in a lot of scenarios, because you're able to give that shield token to prior played units. And it's very likely for you to have a space unit and a ground unit in this format. It is just extremely likely. There are just a lot of pilots, which you'll probably play as ground units in some cases. There's a lot of space units, which you'll have available to you. And that means that you're going to be able to use Lando's action and then get a lot of value and hopefully be able to outtrade your opponent. And then you get this either +5/+5 Sentinel or a 5/7 Sentinel, which isn't bad. That all kind of leads itself together to be pretty good. There is an argument where you want to put him in the B tier, to be honest. Like maybe it's more like high B tier, and I would definitely be potentially convinced easily for Lando, mainly because there are a lot more aggressive leaders. You'll notice like Poe Dameron would probably just run over Lando in most scenarios. Luke Skywalker would like negate the Lando shields. Like some of the higher up leaders, even Darth Vader, I mean, you'll just throw a TIE fighter into their shield token just to get rid of it. Or even like Major Vonreg is going to be able to go in aggressively and probably take down Lando. The 7 to flip is a decent downside, but a big Sentinel is a big Sentinel, and Limited actually benefits from that quite a bit. Next up, we've got Asajj Ventress. This one's kind of interesting. This one's going to kind of just deal a little bit of damage to your units, deal a little bit of damage to their units. I actually don't find that to be exceptionally valuable. The value-orientated Limited games that you're oftentimes going to see really don't want you to be damaging your own units and their units. In some situations, that'll be good. Like you've played a 2-3 and they played a 3-3, for example, on turn 1, and you damage your unit and damage their unit, and now they trade evenly, which is pretty nice. But to be honest, this action isn't really going to generate you any value for the most part in that game. You're not going to have things that synergize with it all that often. There's not as many cards that work with her because they are going to be higher rarity in most situations. Now, for example, one of the cards that I think people are looking at would be like Banshee, the card that's kind of meant for Asajj, right? That's a really good card with Asajj. If you get that, that would be amazing. But that's an uncommon, right? You're not likely to see that in your pool. And so Asajj, especially on her flip side or on her front side, not that valuable. She gets a lot better on her backside because she has a 4/6 grit units, right? Like that's just going to be kind of obnoxious. And you do get that +3/+4 and grit to a space unit. So that's why she would be in the B tiers, just because of her flip is pretty good. And you are going to be able to get a little bit of value from that. But oftentimes I'd rather just have like +3/+3 from Kazuto or Han's flip or Wedge's flip, just because it comes down a turn sooner. And realistically, she does flip for 6 and is a +3/+4 upgrade. Like that's really kind of a weak stat line, even though the ability itself can be decent with grit and the extra damage ping. And lastly, we've got Thrawn, which is kind of fun. Now, Thrawn in your Premier gameplay is going to be not amazing. It's going to be not amazing, but in Limited, he gets, in my opinion, a decent amount better. Not like insane, but a decent amount better. The 6 to flip 4/7 body is not bad at all. And then just getting this random value with your when defeated triggers is going to be a lot more common. Things like the Onyx Squadron Brute is a common, and you're going to get extra value out of that. The Landing Shuttle, you're going to want to be playing that. It's a common. Like these cards that you're not going to be playing oftentimes outside in Premier gameplay are just going to give you extra value in Thrawn, and that's what the game is all about, is getting that extra value. If you do happen to be able to index towards something like the aggression area, where you have a couple commons that work with that when defeated trigger, that's going to be pretty nice. If you happen to pick up, there's just a lot of commons that work specifically with Thrawn that can do some good work. I could see picking up like a Fleet Interdictor and just being absolutely obnoxious. A Chimera, that isn't uncommon, by the way. Or like the Onyx Squadron Brute, which we've seen a lot of, or even like the Landing Shuttle, that's been pretty decent by drawing you a card when it's defeated. Like this just standard, little bit of value here, little bit of value there. Part of me wants to swap Lando and Thrawn, and I actually am going to do that here, because I feel like Lando is actually just more generally useful than Thrawn. But Thrawn, if you do happen to pick up some of those when defeated triggers, he is going to be a decent one to pick up. And he's also just going to generally give you a little bit of value, because there's going to be a good amount of when defeated triggers in general. Like if you're playing Vigilance Villainy, you are probably going to have all the cards that specifically work with Thrawn, which is going to be a nice little addition. So that's going to wrap up the Vigilance leaders, and that's going to be the list, guys. And I think in terms of final thoughts, in order to kind of even out the list and kind of create a little bit more distinctive categories, I would probably, I actually wouldn't put Captain Phasma in C tier. I think the 4/6 body is just good enough. I think Luke Skywalker could definitely push himself into the S tier in terms of just how much value he's going to bring, especially if you have a good amount of those fighters. I would definitely go into Luke if you could, just to get that value rolling. But there's actually a pretty good array of leaders, and a few of them that are kind of unplayable in my opinion that are in Premier. For example, Lando and Rose, I think, are the biggest two offenders of that. I don't think these leaders are good at all in Premier, but in draft, I think they're actually very solid. Now, there's going to be some disagreements, and the more we play, we're going to see more of. I've only played 2 draft games, or pre-release / draft games, these limited formats. And when I say games, I mean like a few matches, like round, or I should say events, a couple of events, draft events with a few games in each of them. So I've only gotten a little bit of experience with a couple of these leaders and got to see a few of them. But this is kind of just my initial impressions based on the cards that we see in format, based on how these decks are being built. And of course, as we open more packs, we're going to see this change. And I will be doing a pre-release guide for you all coming soon, so stay tuned for that. But hopefully you all enjoyed this. I know you all wanted to see it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I will see you all for a video.